Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about the Song of Solomon, also known as the Song of Songs or the Book of Canticles. They're all the same thing. This book is a fairly short book. It's a collection of lyric poetry, and it's unlike any other book in the Bible. Now there are plenty of poetic books in the Bible, in addition to the Song of Solomon, but none quite like this one. So what is special, what is unique about the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon? Number one, God is never mentioned. In that way, it's like the book of Esther. However, in the Song of Songs, God is never even really implied. And that's very much unlike the book of Esther. So if that's the case, how was it that the Song of Songs made it into the Jewish and the Christian canons? Why is it even there? Well, the book made it into the Jewish canon on the basis of an allegorical reading. It was read allegorically as speaking of the love between God and Israel. And it made it into the Christian canon in a similar way on the basis of an allegorical reading. It was read as the love between Christ and the church. Now, allegorical readings were common in the early church, and they weren't unknown in Judaism either. But throughout the first, close to 1,500 years of Christian history, allegorical readings were extremely common. I would say in many ways they were the most common ways of reading the Bible. It wasn't until the 15th century that a man by the name of Nicholas of Lyra came along, and he advocated reading the Bible literally, at least a fair amount of the time. And Nicholas was not averse to allegorical readings either, but he did push the literal reading as well. And he was very influential on a man who came along several decades later, a man by the name of Martin Luther, who was the founder of the Protestant Reformation. In fact, he was so influential, Nicholas of Lyra was, on Martin Luther, that the saying arose that said, if Nicholas hadn't played his lyre, a harp, it's a play on Nicholas's last name, Lyra, if Nicholas hadn't played his lyre, Luther wouldn't have danced. And that's an allusion to Luther's role in composing biblical hymns, but also the fact that he was very influential on Martin Luther. Now, Rabbi Akiva was a famous rabbi, lived in the early 2nd century, and Rabbi Akiva had this to say about the Song of Songs. The entire age is not so worthy as the day on which the Song of Songs was given to Israel. For all the scriptures are holy, but the Song of Songs is the holy of holies, that is, the holiest of all. Akiva also said, he who trills his voice in chanting the Song of Songs in the banquet house, treating it as an ordinary song, has no part in the world to come. It's clear that Rabbi Akiva advocated reading the song allegorically. However, with apologies to Rabbi Akiva, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to treat it as an ordinary song. We're going to look at it as an example of lyric poetry. And then we'll circle back around to the question of how it ought to be interpreted. Robert Alter, whom we've read a couple of readings from him already, he calls the Song of Songs the most consistently secular of all biblical texts. This is in his book, The Art of Poetry. So what is the Song of Songs exactly? It's perhaps a collection of wedding songs, even could be songs that were sung in the fields or in the taverns. There are many allusions within the song to pastoral life or agrarian life. These predominate, but there are also allusions to the royal court as well. And there are several instances of praise of the male and the female body, celebration of lovemaking, desire for the absent lover, separation and reuniting of lovers. All these things are present in the Song of Songs. Now, the Masoretes, these were Jewish scribes who lived in the Middle Ages, they identified 3 books of the Hebrew Bible as poetic by using different accents. And the 3 books were Job, Psalms, and Proverbs. All other books were marked with just regular accents that we use in prose texts. But there are many other books that contain poetry. In fact, the vast majority of books of the Hebrew Bible contain at least some poetry. For example, the book of Lamentations is entirely poetry. There has no prose in it. Song of Songs similarly has no prose in it. And Micah, the book of the prophet Micah, also is purely poetic. In fact, poetry is very common among the prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the minor prophets, many of them have, in fact, most of them are full of poetry alongside some prose in some cases. A man named Robert Lowth, Lowth, wrote a treatise in the year 1754, and this treatise was entitled On the Sacred Poetry of the Hebrews. And Lowth was the first one, at least first modern scholar, to identify parallelism as the key component of biblical Hebrew poetry. If I were to ask you, how would you define poetry, you might start off by saying, well, poetry is something that rhymes. The end of the verses rhyme. Well, some poems rhyme and some don't in English poetry and in other languages as well. Some poetry doesn't rhyme at all in some traditions. For example, Old English poetry, like Beowulf, doesn't rhyme. Instead, the composers used alliteration. They would use the same consonant or sometimes vowel in the line. It would be repeated, and that was how the rhyming sounds were used. They weren't vowel sounds at all. And in the case of Hebrew, rhyme is almost entirely absent in poetry. There might be a few occasions of it. There are plays on words, certainly, but poetry in general, in Hebrew and in other Semitic traditions, is based on parallelism. Now, there's a document on the class website entitled, let me see what I called it, Hebrew Poetry, A Short Overview, and you might take a look at that. This gives several examples of parallelism, and there are three forms of parallelism. There's synonymous parallelism, where the second line repeats the ideas of the first line, just using different words. There's antithetic parallelism, where the second line contrasts with the ideas of the first line. And then there is synthetic parallelism, where the second line continues the idea of the first line. And then there are variants, many variants of these as well. So, for example, let's see. Let me give you, I gave some examples in the overview of Hebrew poetry document. Let me give you one additional example of each of these three. For synonymous parallelism, Psalm 2, verse 1 says, "Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain?" Well, this is an example of synonymous parallelism. The word nations in the first line corresponds to the word peoples in the second line. The word conspire in the first line corresponds to the word plot in the second line. So you can see the second line is repeating the idea of the first line, just in different words. Let me read it again. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? Okay, an example of antithetic parallelism, where the second line repeats the idea of the first line, but as a negative. An example of this is Psalm 119, verse 113. It says this, "I hate the double-minded, but I love your law." All right, so hate and love are obviously opposites, but really the poet is saying more or less the same thing. I hate the double-minded, that is, those who are wishy-washy, those who can't stick to anything, but I love your law. The law is obviously talking about the Jewish law, and it has to do with following the law precisely, which is the opposite of being double-minded. And then finally, synthetic, an example of synthetic parallelism, the Song of Songs. Chapter 1, verse 2, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine." So the second line doesn't repeat the idea of the first, it just sort of continues it. All right. Let's go ahead and look now at the Song of Songs. We'll look at just a few verses in here, and we'll look at the parallelism. We'll look at the plays on words. That's another characteristic of Hebrew poetry, is that there are many literary devices that are used, word pairs, alliteration, plays on words, puns. It's a fancy name for that is paronomasia. There are metaphors, personification, mythological language, and I give examples of all of these in the document. That's an overview of Hebrew poetry on the class website. Okay, let's look at some of these in the Song of Songs. All right, we've already read chapter 1, verse 2. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. This word, let him kiss me, in Hebrew is pronounced yishakeni, and it's a play on the word yashkeni, which means let him give me to drink. And you'll notice that the idea of drinking is in the second half of that verse. It's talking about drinking wine, comparison of love with wine. You'll notice another thing that happens here is that the author switches between third person in the first half of the verse to second person, you, in the second half of the verse. So this is fairly common in throughout the Song of Songs. All right, verse 3. Your anointing oils are fragrant. Your name is perfume poured out. This reminds me of the statement that Juliet makes in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. In verse 4, there's a reference to the king. Draw me after you, let us make haste. The king has brought me into his chambers. This is probably not a reference to a literal king, because as you read through the entire book, it's clear that the setting is more agrarian, it's more rural. But so the king here probably refers to the male lover. The voices go back and forth. Sometimes the male lover is speaking, sometimes the female lover is speaking. Verse 5, the woman is speaking now. I am black and beautiful, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. This reference to the female lover's blackness, darkness, suggests membership in the lower class, someone who must work outside in the sun, and therefore in some parts of the world, being dark is considered to be a sign of beauty. In other parts of the world, it's considered to be a sign of the lower classes because they're the ones who have to work outside and get suntanned or sunburned. Verse 6, do not gaze at me because I am dark, because the sun has gazed on me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I have not kept. Well, this is referring to the woman working outside, but also that last line, my own vineyard I have not kept, is a metaphor for sexual activity. All right. Verse 9, I compare you, my love, to a mare. This is the man speaking now. I compare you, my love, to a mare among Pharaoh's chariots. Perhaps this is an allusion to the confusion that would be caused if a mare, a female horse, in heat, wandered among the chariot horses of the Pharaoh. I mean, all sorts of things, all sorts of havoc would break out. Chapter 1, verses 12 through 14. While the king was on his couch, my nard, that's perfume, gave forth its fragrance. My beloved is to me a bag of myrrh that lies between my breasts. My beloved is to me a cluster of henna blossoms in the vineyards of En-gedi. This is a picture of the man lying on top of a woman with his head between her breasts. And allusions to fragrance probably imply lovemaking. So as you can see, these poems are very erotic. They use vivid imagery, and that's not where it stops even there. Let's look in chapter 7. I'm not going to read all of this, but start with verse 1. This is the man speaking now to the woman. How graceful are your feet in sandals, O queenly maiden. Your rounded thighs are like jewels, the work of a master's hand. Your navel is a rounded bowl that never lacks mixed wine. Your belly is a heap of wheat encircled with lilies. Your two breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle. Your neck is like an ivory tower. Your pools are pools in Heshbon by the gate of Bath Rabbim. Your nose is like a tower of Lebanon overlooking Damascus. Your head crowns you like Carmel, Mount Carmel, and your flowing locks are like purple. A king is held captive in the tresses. And so the man is describing his lover's beauty, starting with her feet and working his way up. All right. And the female lover in chapter 7 still, starting in verse 10, she speaks as well. I am my beloved's, and his desire is for me. Come, my beloved, let us go forth into the fields and lodge in the villages. Let us go out early to the vineyards and see whether the vines have budded. This connection between vines or wine and love is something that is common throughout the Mediterranean world. The Greek god Bacchus, of course, was associated with wine and debauchery and things like that as well. Let us go into the vineyards, see whether the vines have budded, whether the grape blossoms have opened and the pomegranates are in bloom. There I will give you my love. The mandrakes give forth fragrance, and over our doors are all choice fruits, new as well as old, which I have laid up for you, O my beloved. Mandrakes are a plant that was believed to be an aphrodisiac and possess properties of fertility. In fact, it's referenced in Genesis chapter 30, verses 14 through 16. You can go back and read that. So these poems are very clearly erotic poems. They talk about physical love between a man and a woman, and it's an interesting question from a modern perspective how this book came to be included in the Bible, both for Jews and for Christians. If the Bible is read, or if these poems rather are read literally as love poems, then they would be very appropriate for a wedding celebration or renewal of vows or something like that. On the other hand, if they're read allegorically, they can be thought of as referring to God's love for Israel or Christ's love for the church, as I mentioned before. So I'm going to end here, and we'll come together and talk about this